Hello, welcome back to another CleaveTech Tech Tip. And if this is your first time watching a CleaveTech Tech Tip, then I encourage you to go to my channel and have a look at some of my other tech tips. I've learned a lot from people in slot racing over the years, and I've been giving something back, so you can learn a lot by taking a look at my channel. So go ahead. Anyway, on to today's tech tip. Now, if you watched last week's video, you will have seen my second place at the World Championships production car. So we're going to carry on a closer look, and as I said, we'll look at something to do with technical inspection, and it's all about this back end here. Now, if you've been following my slot racing for a while, you know back in 2019 myself and Gavin Wills actually won the team race in the UK. We won it by quite a margin. And then there was a protest that somebody said we've been doing stuff to our chassis we shouldn't be doing and grinding out holes, etc. There was a big, long talk about all the other teams that had done the same thing and ground out bits of their chassis to make things fit better. There was a huge investigation. Some of the top racers examined chassis and so on, threw some people out, but not us out. There was a whole big thing about it. And in the end, we were excluded from the result. We were disqualified because they found a tiny little mark on the chassis here or somewhere around about there. And they said we ground our chassis and removed a bit of the chassis. So it was all a bit of ill feeling and it was not a great race. So this year, myself and Gavin Wills had something to prove at the next Worlds round. And we weren't on our home track. We were flying away. We were going to Latvia and we had something to prove. And getting a second place at the Israel World Championships, away from home, not on your home track, doing it again, getting a win and a second place in 2 years running, I think shows that we are a team to be reckoned with and some good drivers and good car preparation, and we can do it. So hopefully we can do one better in America next year. Now, because of that, before I built the chassis, I also took loads and loads and loads of photos of it as it came out of the packet. So if there ever was any queries about any strange marks on the chassis, anything like that, I had photographic evidence, time-stamped, of when those were photographed, just straight away, just as it came out of the handout and was given straight to us. So I photographed it all this time round, just to make sure that we didn't get accused of doing things that we haven't done. You can see at the front here, I've taped over the J-bar here just to hold that front J-bar in. In accidents, it can get caught, it can get hit, it can get bashed, so taping it in means that you perhaps don't lose your J-bar. The back one here is just stuck a little bit to that gel tape, so again, that sort of helps hold it in place. It does move a fraction, but again, shouldn't fall out. And the back one very rarely does fall out anyway. It's very hard to knock the rear one out, but the front one does get caught in collisions and can occasionally get knocked out of place. So this year, as I've said in my Facebook post and YouTube post, it was so friendly this year. I think everybody was really glad to be back slot racing out and just having a good time. And it was one of the friendliest World Championships I've ever been to. There were very few protests, very few issues. Luckily, sort of nobody ever protested any real cars or anything like that. But there was one minor issue in scrutineering for the team race, and I'll try my best to explain it to you now. So in order to stop you using, I suppose, really, really tiny gears or really sort of lowering the centre of gravity too much, there is a rule that says about the height of the axle. Now everybody has to use a 332 axle, so the height from the top of the axle and the rules state to the bottom of the chassis is 8.6 millimetres. Now that's how I built my chassis. I built it to actually 8.61, but when I came to scrutineering, I got the car thrown out. They said the axle wasn't high enough. Now the way they were measuring the axle was they had a little jig, or a little tool I suppose, a little gauge that measured it from the top of the axle to the bottom of the chassis, just under here like this. So I'll show you what it now measures. So we're 8.62 that side, and this side we are 8. See, it's close depending on how hard I push it, 8.61 there. Now when they actually measured it in technical inspection, it was something like 8.58, which is obviously appears to be too low. But the rules state it's from the bottom of the chassis. Now, if you just put a gauge across there and there, you're measuring it from the bottom of the chassis under the axle. Now, that's not what it says. It says from the bottom of the chassis. Now, when these chassis come out of the packet, the back end of the chassis actually has a bend upwards in that direction. Now, I wasn't going to spend ages and ages sorting out that bend at the rear of the chassis when the rest of the chassis was totally flat. So as long as I could see the axle was high enough off of the bottom of the chassis when it sat on a flat block, it would be fine. And it was 8.61 from the bottom of the chassis. If you put a caliper on it and you used the depth gauge like that down to the bottom of the chassis as it was sitting on the block, it was fine. But they wanted to measure it with a tiny little gauge here at the back, which I know is very quick to do, and I understand why they were doing it, but for me that didn't match the rules that were published. So anyway, they made me take my car away and I had to raise the back axle. Now this was with 10 minutes to go of technical inspection, so I could have taken the whole motor out, I could have reset the whole back axle with my little axle jig blocks at a higher setting, etc. But I thought maybe I don't have time to do that, so I had to do it all by eye and all by hand. So I just heated up each one and moved it a fraction up like that with a bit of tape underneath my jig blocks each side. And I didn't even move the motor, and I still had to retain the gear mesh. And luckily I was skillful enough to do the job and got through tech. But in the future, I think that's perhaps something ISRA need to look at about how they're going to measure the height of the rear axle. Or it's something, again, I need to plan for in advance. Now that I know how they're measuring it, then I'll have to raise the back axle, or I'll have to flatten this bit at the back of the chassis. But it's just an interesting way of how they did technical inspection and how the rules are written and how they were interpreted and measured at the time. In the end, didn't cause any too much issues. I fixed it, it was done, it was back into tech in time, and the car ran perfectly. But it is a little bit of a worry when you go to tech and you think the car's running really, really nice, and then you have to mess around with the gear mesh and the axle heights on the back, and you think, have I got this set up right? You know, is each side the same height? And you can see it's not quite perfect now because I had to do it by eye. It is a little bit lower on one side than the other. But clearly the car worked well. It went to second place at the World Championships, a lap down on the winners, which were Piero Castriconi and Luca Sobrana, who did a fantastic job. They both drove very, very well, kept it in the slot, kept a good pace, and we just couldn't catch them at the end of the race. But it was a fantastic race. I really enjoyed it. It was really great fun.
Grande Luca.
Non li conoscevo
Tantissimo. Bravi ragazzi. Bravo Gugu. Guarda papà orgoglioso. Bella. Grandissimo Piero. Mitici. Complimenti.
And that's what slot racing should be about. It should be competitive. It should be tough. It should be engineering. It should be driving. And it should also be fun. And it was. Now, just a final point on these handout bodies. When you get them, they're a full depth body. You have to trim them. You have to mount them. So you have to do all the work yourself to the body. They're pre-painted. And that's about it. You have to trim them all out, set them up, pin them, etc. on your car. And something that did prove really, really good was my body jig to pin these bodies. So again, I showed that in my last video. This little product here, it's my body jig, and it has a little mount here for supporting the wing at the back. You can set the pins, you can get the body shell in the right position on the chassis, and you can pin the car. I'll put a link here to the video showing you how to do that. But when people saw me doing that, they really liked the idea. Quite a few people purchased a body jig in advance of that because they knew they'd have to do that job. A few people borrowed body jigs, etc. from people. So it's a really great product, and it was really, really useful for that. And I'm pleased that, again, it was Gavin Wheels ultimately who came up with the idea of making a body jig. And then I managed to design and make one. But it worked really, really well. And say the racers loved that product. So that really is 24th production. A second place at the World Championships. Can't complain. Thank you very much for watching another CleaveTech Tech Tip video. Stay tuned. There will be more on some of the other classes, and you will even get to see the World Championship winning Formula 1 car.